Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming to this lunchtime seminar where this book will be presented and sort of launched in the UK, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And very fortunate to have speakers here. And so let me first of all introduce myself and then the speakers. I'm Dirk de Velde. I'm a research fellow and also a program leader on the investment and growth at the Overseas Development Institute. And here we're very interested in questions about what can promote growth in developing countries and how can governments help to attract industries, new industries. So I think this new book, which is called New Industries from New Places, is very interesting to us, but also I think for developing countries. And it's particularly interesting, I think, because of two reasons. The first is that it's very practical, is that a lot of developing countries think about how can we attract new industries, what can we do? And they're looking for practical advice. But there's also another, I think, important area that this book touches upon. And I think that's important for development policy generally. And that is about the role of government in all of this. What is the role of government in private sector development? What is the role of government in promoting growth? And I think there's sort of this dichotomy in approaches. There's, on the one hand, you have those that argue, they say, well, the government has to get out of the way of everything. It's laissez-faire. And then on the other hand, there are those that say, well, the government can intervene in every sector, left, right, and centre. And I think that, and I hope that what we'll hear today is something that can try to reconcile the approaches and to say, well, what works where and how. We have two speakers and then a discussant, and the two speakers will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then Simon Commander, the discussant, will discuss. The two speakers are, first of all, to my left is Neil Gregory. He is the advisor to the Vice President for Financial and Private Sector Development at the World Bank. And to my right is Stanley Nolen. He's the Professor of International Business at Georgetown University, US. Just to say that this meeting is on the record. There will also be some people watching us online, I think. And so I think without further ado, we should just start. And Neil, would you like to start?
Well, good afternoon. I'm going to make this presentation jointly with Stan, so there'll be a little bit of juggling microphones, but we'll try and make it as smooth as we can. So this piece of research we're going to present to you today is something which came out of my work on South Asia for IFC, and other colleagues, Dorian Tenner, who isn't here today, was working on East Asia and IFC at the time, and so looking a lot at the very rapid industrial growth in both of those countries and having the usual discussions that people have about comparing and contrasting the growth experiences of China and India. We really wanted to get beyond the usual sort of anecdotal discussions that people have and try and find a way of bringing some original data to bear. And we had some macro level data sets from the World Bank in terms of investment climate surveys, doing business indicators and so forth. But we felt that to really get at the bottom of what explained these growth experiences, we needed also to interview firms directly. Stoyan and I had previously done a survey of the private sector in China using this interview technique, and it had given us a lot of insights. And so this was the approach we wanted to take for this study as well. So to try and get at this, to find some insights into these growth stories in India and China, we decided to narrow down our research and pick just two sectors to compare in the two countries. In China, software and hardware kind of came to us as a fairly obvious choice, partly because they were so prominent, and partly because they're complementary industries. but most importantly, because they're both new industries, they're both really just been in existence for around 20 years in each country. And what this newness does is it allows you actually to be able to trace the growth of these industries pretty much from the start. We could actually go and interview people who had been in right at the start of these industries and could really explain how they got going. It also means that as a new industry, the growth of these industries has been less dependent on policy mistakes of the past. As we know, if you go back more than 20 years, there was no private sector in China. India's private sector was very heavily regulated, a very old-style import substitution type of industrial policy. And so many industries are still working off the legacy of the past industrial policies, whereas these were industries which, because they started really in the reform era in both countries, were able to kind of start from a clean sheet of paper. And so that also was an advantage for understanding how current industrial policies are working as opposed to looking at the mistakes of the past. So what we'll present to you today is what we found really from combining survey data with the sort of more macro investment climate data. And let me say a little bit more about the sample. We sampled just over 300 firms in the two countries, and this was based on face-to-face interviews with company executives. It's split across hardware and software, as you can see. And in terms of what that means, I want to be careful to explain that software really does mean software products and services, but not BPO or IT-enabled services. We're not talking about call centers here. We're talking about people who are writing software, either packaged products or providing software services to companies. And similarly, in hardware, we're taking a particular slice of the electronics manufacturing sector. So we're not talking about manufacturing TVs or fridges or anything else. We're talking about just manufacturing hardware for computers, peripherals, telecoms equipment, and the like. So it's quite narrowly focused in order to get meaningfully sized samples of comparably sized firms. So what we're going to do today is my colleague Stan is going to explain what we found when we compared the software sectors in the two countries. I'll then talk a bit about the hardware sectors, and then I'll try and draw some conclusions about what we learned from this research, what it tells us about investment climate and industrial growth policies. So, Stan?
Thank you, Neil. And those of you seated at the far right hand of the room, can you see the screen? If not, you can, oh, you have it there. So you're okay. Thank you. I'm pleased to be here in London today. I lived in London for a year many years ago, never wanted to leave, and so I'm glad now to be back just for a few days. This is a picture of the size and growth in the last years since 1990 up to now of the software industries in these two countries, China and India, and you see beautiful exponential growth curves, and you also see that the Chinese industry, by using Chinese data, appears to be as large and fast growing, maybe bigger even than the Indian industry, a fact that is not well known by everyone. But where the difference comes is this one. You see that the Chinese industry is domestic products, the Indian industry is exports. And that's what the question is. Why should Indian software be such a successful export industry when the Chinese industry, equally as large and fast growing, is not? Now, if you ask people on the street what's the answer to that question, you'll get a series of standard answers. The first one almost always is labor costs. We believe that that argument is at best incomplete. Second argument you hear about is government. It is the benign neglect of software by the Indian government that overregulated manufacturing. That argument, we believe, is simply untrue. Third argument you hear is English language. All educated Indians are English speakers, and the major export markets use English language software, so there's the Indian advantage. This, we believe, is half right and misunderstood. And a fourth frequent answer you hear is it's the non-resident Indians, the NRIs in Silicon Valley, who have contributed to the development of the Indian industry. We also think this argument is half right and very much overstated. Let's take these four arguments in turn. and analyze them very closely. And then let's also add a couple of insights we believe we can gain from our more micro-level, firm-level survey data. First, the labor argument. It goes like this. You see, India has an ample and abundant supply of technically well-educated people who are paid low wages in dollar, pound, or euro terms, and therefore they have low costs. We assume that productivity is okay. And that's true. Indian software labor cost is low compared to US, UK, or other importing countries. But what about China? Does China not have an ample supply of educated labor, paid low wages? And the answer is yes, it does. So I think the story is not finished by saying India's low labor cost. Now, let us remember about comparative advantage. Exports depend on comparative, not absolute advantage. And we have some evidence, not in our study, but in other studies, which say that India does have comparative advantage in software. So it could be true that India and China have equal costs in software services and products, but India is an exporter, China is not, because of the hardware difference between the two countries. That may be true, but let's also look more carefully at the labor argument. So the first thing we do is to calculate a unit labor cost. So for the industries overall in both countries, we measure labor productivity from our firm-level data. We add information on wage rates, and we get unit labor costs, and there you see the numbers, 40 cents per dollar in India and 31 cents in China. So India does not have an overall unit labor cost advantage over China. So the story gets harder to tell, doesn't it? We have to now be a little more detailed in our analysis. This model on the screen is a framework for explaining labor productivity and unit labor cost. And the three main points you see in the red circles here are as follows. First of all, we measure labor productivity separately for services firms versus products firms because their technologies are different. And we measure both output per worker and value added by labor, two different measures of labor productivity. And on the left-hand side, you see an auxiliary regression analysis intended to isolate the important determinants of labor productivity that explain these differences measured here in this center box. And labor skill is important, we find, and so also is something we call management effectiveness. Here is the result we find for labor productivity. You see in the top line, if you take all software firms together, you actually have a lower figure for India than for China, and that difference is significant. But if you take software services firms, you find the reversal. Here you find India with larger labor productivity, China smaller, that's significant. And for products firms, you find the reverse. China's number is higher than India's number. Same is true for value-added measure of labor productivity. So the first finding here is Indian software services firms did have higher labor productivity, and that's what they export. Second, about the skill features of labor that determine productivity. One of them is that Indian software firms employ more professionals than Chinese firms by far, and those professionals have more education. So from this we conclude that labor skill is superior in Indian software firms, and from our regression analysis, that's this box back here, this is an important determinant of labor productivity. And next, we come to a heading here called management, and we have 5 Indian advantages that are managerially based, not just production labor based. The first one is this: Indian software firms have higher value added by labor than Chinese software firms after accounting for other determinants of value added and productivity. So back to here one more time. All of these taken into account leaves something out, and that is the country of the software firm. Now, to be Indian does not give you labor productivity. It's something else unmeasured that the Indian dummy variable is accounting for. And we think that unmeasured determinant is management effectiveness. Second Indian management advantage is more experience on the part of software managers. They have more experience abroad. Of course, that comes naturally from having more international orientation or export business. But also, in terms of overall experience, the Indian software managers that had more contribute, you see the +7, to revenue growth. It is not true in China. So more experience counts in Indian software, but not in Chinese software. Third management advantage for India is quality certifications. Indian software people were leaders, along with Carnegie Mellon University, in initiating and promoting and having used an ISO type of quality certification called Capability Maturity Model. Now, and that mattered. You see many, many more Indian firms than Chinese have these CMM certifications. They have more of them, and that contributed to Indian software firm revenue growth. That is one of the most important determinants we have found, quality certifications. And of course, you see in the early days of software, India was not well known as a country that provided quality products and services. So that liability of foreigners had to be overcome. This was one way to do it, to show that you could make the project on time, in full, and at budget. The fourth management advantage is, I think, our other main finding about these differences between India and China, and that is international alliances. You know that Indian software is homegrown. The big companies are all Indian founded, owned, and operated. Tata Consultancy Services, Infosys, Wipro, Satyam, HCL, they're all Indian, not foreign. In fact, you have to get down to number 8 in the list of firm sizes to find a foreign firm in Indian software. Well, it's not foreign ownership that mattered. No, it's something different. It's non-equity strategic alliances that mattered. And here you see the difference between India and China. 60% of Indian software firms had these foreign alliances, only 11.9% of Chinese. Furthermore, Indian firms had more of them, and once again, those alliances contributed to Indian software firms' revenue growth. So quality certifications, foreign alliances are two of the main management actions that we believe made a difference to the success of Indian software, but not Chinese software as an export industry. Then there is a fifth and last one, which is something that's a little hard, I think, to explain with numbers, but we'll try. We were told by Indian managers and professors when interviewing people prior to data collection this: Indians don't follow the rules. If you are in India yourself, you will see this happening many times. Indians don't follow the rules. Now, second point, software production is in part a creative process. Benefits from ingenuity, initiative, quick decision making, and the national culture. Next point in India has two features. Indians tolerate ambiguity and are comfortable with unstructured situations, unlike Chinese national culture. And Indians are different from China most widely in national culture in terms of individualism. So it seems to us as though the Indian national culture features, contrasted with Chinese, lend themselves to Indian software production. So we tried to analyze this with numbers. Now the slide is too small. Let me explain. First of all, entrepreneurial orientation is something else that people told us was a characteristic of Indians, but it's not different for Chinese. And we're not the only ones to find that numerical difference not being significant. No, it's not entrepreneurship that distinguishes Indians from Chinese. It is rather this feature here, independence of action, Indians don't follow the rules, combined with entrepreneurial orientation in an interaction that matters. So this variable, these are scale values, is what separates Indian from Chinese software firms. The combination of entrepreneurship, which is not greater in India, with not following the rules, which is different in India than China. And with that, I'm going to ask Neil to come back. There are these other two features about English language in our eyes that I think we have evidence on, but I think I'll leave that until questions toward the end, if you don't mind. Now we come to some data about hardware.
Thank you. So when we come to talk about hardware, unlike software, where we saw that both industries were large in both China and India, we really see a huge difference in scale between India and China. It's not just that China has achieved export success, and India hasn't. India hasn't even been able to serve its domestic market. So China is just in a totally different order of magnitude. China has somewhere around half of the global market for hardware manufacturing. So it really is a huge global player, and India is really nowhere in comparison. So when we look at the manufacturing side, we really need to explain what it was about China's policies which enabled the industry to take off and capture that big share of the global market that wasn't there in India. So again, looking at the kind of factors of production and how that might have affected it, we don't find the explanation in labor costs. We find that unit labor costs are actually quite similar by the time you take into account the fact that labor costs have been rising in China. We find over time, in fact, China's labor costs, if anything, have become more expensive than India's. So this really can't be the explanation for why China grew. It was not a cheap labor story. No, we do see a cheap labor story, I think, in some other parts of manufacturing in China, more assembly type, electronics assembly, garments, and so on. But this is a more specialized type of manufacturing. It's more knowledge intensive, more research intensive, and so probably why labor advantage is not the real story here. Unlike software, manufacturing requires more access to capital. It's relatively capital intensive, and so you might think that the cost or availability of capital would make a difference. Now, China did have better access to capital from FDI. It's a much more open environment for bringing in FDI, and also had lower real interest rates and easier access to capital from domestic capital markets as well. But actually we found in the survey that the Indian firms borrowed more from domestic banks, and neither in India or China was equity capital an important source of growth. So again, it doesn't really seem to be a case that differences in availability of capital are really driving this story. What is quite different is the access to technology and to research and development. We see that there's much higher R&D spending by Chinese hardware companies than in India, and also they have greater access to outside sources of R&D, both from government sources, from linkages with government research institutions, and also from the linkages created by the FDI, that they have access to technological inputs from their partners. But there's also homegrown research and development in these firms, and we find much higher levels of filings for patents, for example, in the Chinese firms than we do in the Indian firms. Stan talked about the importance of the CMM certifications in the software industry. In the hardware industry, it's the ISO quality certifications which are relevant. And here we find that China has done a better job than India in getting certified with ISO certifications. But clearly it does matter. And for Indian companies that are lagging behind on this, those companies which do manage to get certified, it has a strong impact on their revenue growth. This impact seems to be declining at the margin in China. When you get to the point that almost the whole industry is certified, the kind of signaling effects of being certified may start to be less relevant. But we think, as in the software side, quality certifications matter, and this is, to some extent, a proxy for having good management systems and good management quality to enable you to attain and maintain those standards. There's also this cultural aspect to the manufacturing side as there is to the software side. The flip side of having your argumentative Indians not taking orders is that there does seem to be a certain level of discipline in the Chinese workforce, and this is something which we feel very hesitant in our research about, not wanting to fall back on cultural stereotypes, but this is things which we directly ask the companies in the survey about whether their employees follow instructions, and we got fairly clear statistically significant differences between the two countries. So it's something that we need to handle with care in the way we talk about it, but there does seem to be something there in terms of the organization and discipline of the workforce in China. But when we put this together, I think these static explanations of different inputs are not the whole story. When we talk to the companies in the industry and we look at the literature in the industry, we also see that there's a very dynamic story going on that isn't just captured by these static comparisons. So while at the beginning it may have been the case that cheap labour costs and lower cost of capital may have helped get this industry started, it no longer seems to be the key drivers for their success. What has emerged as the industry has grown is the importance of access to technology, the ability to innovate, the ability to manage for quality. And this is what's enabled China to become globally dominant in this industry. So then the question is, how did that sort of favourable dynamic come to be developed by China, but not by India? One difference about manufacturing compared to software and other services is that it's much more dependent on a long supply chain of inputs. In the case of software, you really get some skilled staff and some computers together, and that's about all you need. The process of manufacturing relies on lots more inputs of intermediate goods. It relies upon better availability of land, better availability of capital. And so the linkages to other suppliers of inputs are more important. What this means is there's more barriers to getting started in this industry, but once you do get started and you establish a critical mass of input suppliers, particularly clustered in one location, then you have the potential to get these dynamic comparative advantage starting to kick in, and you get a virtuous growth cycle. And so this is what China seems to have done and India has not done, and that explains why you see this exponential growth in China, but not in India. And we think there are two ways in which the Chinese managed to kickstart this process for the hardware industry. The first one was by opening up to FDI in the manufacturing sector in a very big way. And so we see much greater prevalence of FDI in the Chinese hardware sector than we see in India. What FDI brought was not just access to capital, but also access to technology and access to world-class management systems. And so this enabled them to attain those standards, and also it helped to integrate these companies into global supply chains, both on the input and the output side. So FDI is a clear distinction between China and India. The other thing which China did much earlier than India was to create special economic zones. These were zones where government made special concessions. They made it easier for foreign investors to come in. They made it easy to access industrial land. They provided better access to physical infrastructure, which is more important for hardware than it is for software. And so by making these things more easily available, but only in certain geographical locations, what you did is not just make it easier to get the inputs you need, but you actually encourage the formation of industrial clusters. And that's what you see in some of the coastal areas of China, is that you see a lot of manufacturing capacity clustered into certain coastal zones, and you have very close linkages emerging between the different suppliers in that location, and also with local universities and research institutes, and so you get this clustering dynamic happening. India, in contrast, only started to introduce special economic zones in a serious way in 2006, whereas China started this back in the late 1990s. So this was an example where China made an early policy move which really helped to accelerate the growth of this sector. So now let me try and talk a little bit about what we can learn from these experiences for the investment climate and industrial policy. And to begin with, I think we have to take note of a paradox that we need to explain, which is that at the macro level, when you look at country level indicators of the quality of the investment climate, such as the World Bank doing business indicators, both China and India actually have pretty poor investment climates. In the year in which we did this survey, China ranked 108 out of 155 countries in the doing business indicators, and India 138. So these were not at the macro level countries where it's easy for the private sector to do business. And other investment climate indicators paint a similar picture. And so the paradox is, how were they able in these particular industries to overcome these constraints? And let's look at these constraints in a little bit more detail. And the first thing to notice is that in both countries, corruption is seen as being the biggest constraint in enterprise surveys of these countries, and that applies also to the high-tech industry. And part of what this may be telling us is that corruption may be a proxy for over-regulation, which leads to more points of contact with government, and that leads to more opportunities for rent-seeking behavior. We also see that taxation is important in both countries, and so these are some of the, and then business regulation, these are some of the areas where government creates a burden on the private sector. Government is also needed to provide infrastructure to a large extent, and so the availability of infrastructure is another part of the investment climate where for a long time China and India were also doing quite poorly. I mean, you see here that both in China and India, access to power is seen as critical by companies, and also see access to transportation infrastructure is particularly important for manufacturing, where you have physical goods to convey, and access to telecoms infrastructure is particularly important for software, where you need to have good broadband connections. So what we wanted to, and that just gives you a little bit of more quantitative feel for what that means. And that's interesting, I think, you see the impact of the regulatory barriers and the infrastructure weaknesses lead to companies in these countries having to carry high levels of inventory to make up for the delays. And you see that that's a bigger problem in India than China. So the question that we're trying to answer is, how did the investment climate affect these two particular sectors of hardware and software? And what was it the government did wrong or did right that enabled the software sector in India and the hardware sector in China to grow despite the difficult investment climate? And so in our surveys, we basically asked the companies, how did government help you and how did government hinder you, on a rating of 1 to 5? And let me quickly walk you through the results. So and first thing I want to say is that on the software side, there wasn't a big difference between the two countries, and we couldn't really find a lot of statistical differences in terms of the impact of the investment climate, leading to things like overmanning, leading to having to spend a long time dealing with government. It was similar in both countries. And a key burden there is that management is having to spend about 10% of its time dealing with government, which is an indicator of the cost of the regulatory burden. When we asked the software companies how government hinders their growth, we see the biggest significant difference between the countries is bureaucracy and paperwork, where India clearly comes out worse. But in both countries, the things that companies really cared about was taxation and the availability of the infrastructure they needed. And so that also is what you see when you ask them how government helps. The biggest thing that helps them, therefore, is tax concessions and the provision of infrastructure. Interestingly, you see that Chinese companies also felt that they got a lot more help from government than in India in terms of research and development. And in India, what really helped in an environment where the overall policy was very restrictive for imports was liberalization of import policies, and similarly liberalization of FDI policies, which were more of a constraint. So what this is really telling us is where there are big investment climate constraints at the macro level, government action to alleviate them for the specific sector was seen as particularly helpful. Story on the hardware side, again, we don't see a lot of significant differences. For example, we don't see the differences in labor regulations led to overemployment in India versus China, which is something that you might expect to see. Interestingly enough, we see that, in fact, it's in China that customs delays seem to cost more time than in India. So, again, not really supporting a story that it's all about government regulation that was holding back manufacturing in India. So what was holding back? How was it that government was getting in the way of the hardware industry? Again, the biggest factors, taxation and infrastructure, so consistent the story with what we see on the software side. India does say that the burden of bureaucracy is higher than in China. That's a significant difference, and also the burden of high import tariffs. So that's consistent with what we know about the business environment there. But what's also interesting is how government is able to help. And for both countries, the most important thing, again, is infrastructure provision. For China, the companies also welcome government support for marketing, but not so much in India, and I'll explain. The explanation for that is that Indian companies obviously had the greater linkages, which Stan talked about earlier, and so government support was less needed than it was in China. Again, Chinese support for R&D was seen as a significant difference. That Chinese companies felt they got more help from government than the Indian companies did. But if you look at the number at the bottom, I think in both countries, the firms clearly benefited a lot from income tax concessions. So let me now save you from to look at any more slides, because what I want to try and do is not give you more numbers, but try and sort of tie together a couple of thoughts of what all these numbers mean. Because what we see then is that governments did do things which either hurt or helped these industries, that there was an impact of industrial policies and government policies on these industries. In neither case were these a story where you can say the government just left things alone and these industries kind of grew under the radar screen and it was whoops, all just happened by accident. No, there were clearly very positive government policies which affected the growth of these industries. And the story that I want to tell about the success of India's software is not one then of benign neglect, but one of a well-designed industrial policy. And this actually dates all the way back to 1985, the days of Rajiv Gandhi, who was very interested in technology at a time when there were hardly any computers at all in India. And around that time, they actually put in place the software technology policy. And what that policy did was well designed to actually reduce the points of contact with government and put in place an environment specifically for software producers, which was much more liberal and much more able to avoid having to deal with government than most other parts of Indian industry, including hardware manufacturing. So the software technology policy put in place wide-ranging tax exemptions. It exempted software manufacturers from the normal restrictions on importing equipment, and also it led to the creation of software technology parks by governments. These were technology parks, provided access to land and broadband connections at a time when it was very difficult to get good telecoms connections in India. So what this did was it provided the ability for software firms to get established in these parks with a little bit of infrastructure that they needed, and then within those confines of those parks, government pretty much left the industry alone. It was a kind of a sort of a ring fencing of this new sector from the kind of policies which affected the manufacturing sector. How was India able to do this for software but not for hardware? I think this is kind of a political economy story, that it would be much harder to put in place similar concessions for hardware manufacturing because you couldn't really ring fence it from manufacturing in general. In the manufacturing sector in general, there were long-standing industrial policies, labour regulations, import restrictions, and so on. And there's been a long process, which is still going on in India, to liberalise and reduce the burden of those policies. So it's very difficult to carve out or make a change to policies once they're in place. There are lots of vested interests, lots of people are receiving rents from existing restrictions. But the fact that software was a new industry and there really were no vested interests and no established policies on the books made it much easier to start from a clean sheet. And so I think that's part of the explanation for why in India software could have these very growth-supporting policies put in place by government, and government was unable to do it for the manufacturing sector. Now in China, the legacy of past industrial policies was to some extent less of a constraint because most industry up until the mid-1990s was in the hands of state-owned enterprises. It was only after that time that private enterprises really started to get traction. And it was also less of a constraint because most industrial policies were not put together at national level but at provincial level, and the Chinese government actually encouraged provinces to experiment with different approaches to supporting industrial growth. They knew they needed to wind down the state-owned enterprise sector, were concerned about the employment impacts of that, and so most provincial governments were very motivated to create new jobs by encouraging private enterprise, and they were allowed to innovate and experiment with different policies to do that. And out of that experimentation came the initial special economic zones in some of the coastal provinces. The design of these is somewhat similar to what I've described for Indian software, in that they really reduced the kind of regulations that were in place for the rest of the economy. So they reduced the barriers to foreign investment, they gave broad-based tax concessions, they gave easy access to industrial land, good access to infrastructure. So again, enabling policies that really alleviated the more general burdens that industry faced in the country. So then, so just to conclude, let's try and draw a few lessons for other countries from what these experiences can tell us about industrial policies and the investment climate. I think what we see is that the investment climate does matter. It is important determinant of the growth both for industry and for services. And also that the traditional concerns about liberal trade policies and openness to foreign investments, they also clearly matter as well. And that India's legacy of import substitution policies and restrictions on FDI are an important explanation of why manufacturing has struggled to gain traction in India until quite recently. I think another lesson is that vested interests may block reform in established industries, and so it's easier for governments to get quick wins and to start afresh in new industries. And just to give one other example of that, I think next door to India and Bangladesh, the government spent years trying to reform the jute industry and never really succeeded, but in the meantime it was able to support the growth of the garment manufacturing industry. It's often much easier to get policies right in a new sector than in an existing sector. I think these examples also show us that tax concessions can help, but this is not so much about just reducing the monetary burden of taxation as about reducing the points of contact with government, about reducing the deadweight cost of corruption and rent-seeking that goes along with all these points of contact with government. So it wasn't about just putting in place lower taxes, it was about actually giving them a tax-free regime where they just didn't have to deal with the taxman. They didn't have to deal with many other inspectors. But what the story, I think, also tells us is that government succeeded in supporting these industries neither by benign neglect nor by some kind of activist picking winners. I don't think that China ever contributed to the market in computer hardware, or India, when they put in place the software technology policy, I don't think they expected that software exports would become bigger than manufacturing exports. So it was putting in place policies which were enabling but not really trying to determine where the growth would come from. And I think what we're seeing now is that other countries are learning from these experiences. India has adopted special economic zones policies modelled on China, and we're seeing China also, with its big software industry, I think is also now learning from India in the way it's developing its exports.
Neil,
so I think we'll stop at that point and give time for Simon to comment, and then we'll be happy to discuss.